Andy Burnham, in his first major speech since returning to Westminster, has promised to rewire Britain and push through the biggest change in our lifetimes to the way our country is run. Well, can he really pull off such a radical change? In a moment, we'll speak to the Times chief political commentator Patrick Maguire. But first, let's talk to the economist Alfie Sterling. He's the Director of Policy and Economist at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. He's reported also to be working with Andy Burnham, albeit in the background. Good morning.
Good morning. And just for correction, we're not working with Andy Burnham any more than other political teams or political parties.
OK. What did you take away from the speech yesterday? What for you is the central thread?
I think the key thread is about pushing power to where decisions need to get made in order to address an affordability crisis. And I think the second part is particularly important because the scale and urgency of that affordability crisis has just got a whole lot worse with the impacts of conflict in the Middle East. We're now going to have a parliament for the first time on record, according to the current forecast, where people are poorer at the end than they were at the start. And the urgency of that, we are already halfway through that parliament and there's very little time to do something about it.
So do you think that this will be enough? Will it help grow the economy in all regions of this country?
I think there needs to be a long-term piece and there needs to be a shorter-term piece. And part of the long-term piece is about addressing power. It's about, pushing power closer to where decisions need to get needed. It's about rebalancing power between the Treasury and other parts of government. So that is fundamental and it is part of that piece. But it's not on its own sufficient, no. Government needs to also take action now to address the cost of essentials, intervene in the key markets that are causing that pressure, whether that's housing, whether that's energy, and they need to do so in a way that has an impact in the next 2 years. I mean, I think almost all voters fall into one of two categories. They're either fed up because they've been promised change and they haven't seen it, or they're desperate.
And those are a couple of the things that were mentioned, albeit briefly, in the speech yesterday. Alfie, thank you for joining us. That is Alfie Sterling, economist and Director of Policy at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. While listening to that is Patrick Maguire, the chief political commentator for The Times. Good morning, Patrick.
Morning, Kate.
One of the things we've been tussling with this morning is revolutionary versus state of, the way things currently are. What was this for you from Andy Burnham yesterday? Does it signify a big change but under the radar?
Yeah, look, I thought it was deceptively substantial. And by that I mean there was much more to it than the rhetoric might have implied. And that is partly what economists call a demand-side problem. And by that I mean when Westminster hears a speech from Andy Burnham, a lot of the time, so overpowering is his brand, and he did indeed open it by talking about I miss Manchester so much and who wants to hear my DJ set, etc., etc., that when you hear the phrase number 10 North, you basically just think Andy Burnham's going to rent a co-working space every Friday and take an early dart on the train back. But actually, the deceptively substantial bit was listening to him, and I was in that room, set out the mandate for number 10 North, saying it will have responsibility for these three key macroeconomic priorities: regeneration, reindustrialisation, and nationalising or taking public control of the utilities network. And I realised, and I had several conversations that made me realise, this is a deliberate attempt to check the power of the Treasury. It's not an exercise in branding. It's not sort of regional tokenism. This is the Prime Minister taking personal control of his key economic priorities and trying to circumvent the Treasury, right? Doesn't matter that it's necessarily in number 10 North. What matters is those powers are coming back to number 10, and that's hugely significant.
I mean, that would be, as you say, a huge change. It would put an incredible amount of power in the hands of Andy Burnham, and we can talk about whether or not he's sort of done enough to deserve that power or been voted for by the country, which he obviously hasn't been. But it also poses an interesting question about the future of the Treasury, Patrick, and whether or not the Chancellor will be as significant as maybe they have been previously. Does that make the argument for Ed Miliband a little bit easier for Andy Burnham to make if he's basically saying, as he did in his speech, it's actually my way or the highway and this guy's going to have to listen to me?
Yeah, exactly. Look, I think it set the terms for a Chancellor, because it's sort of, they're going to have to be implementing Andy Burnham's agenda. The political direction I set, said Andy Burnham, will not be up for debate, and that was a message to his Chancellor as much as Chancellor to be as much as anyone else. It's not to say the Chancellor won't be important. Of course they will be. They'll still be running the Treasury, but it's setting up this number 10 North and taking back control is at the very least meant to set up a counterweight to the Treasury. Louise Haigh, who's going to be running this government in all likelihood in some role, be it from the Cabinet Office or indeed from this new number 10 setup, has spoken about the Treasury being too imperial in its ambitions and having too many powers. But the Chancellor will have to be on board with this as a prerequisite, and it's notable, I think, that this time last week Shabana Mahmood hadn't spoken to Andy Burnham. I was told, yes, she'd struggled to say no to the job of Chancellor, but also she's not going to sign up just to anything. And given everything we know about Shabana Mahmood wanting to drive through big change in her department and her own agenda, is this now a less tempting offer? Let's see. I think the only person who knows ultimately is Andy Burnham, and any commentator who comes on your show is and claims to know otherwise is lying.
I mean, Patrick, the one thing that we should mention is that the response to this speech, while I think interested and intrigued by the optimism and the general tone, was to say that there was very little in the way of detail. And we are not talking about a man who has a long run in here. We're talking about 20 odd days before Andy Burnham will, in theory, be in number 10 and running things. Is he really credible enough at this point? Do we know enough about what he's intending to do? Do you think he knows enough about what he's intending to do?
I think I'll take those points in turn. I mean, is he credible enough? I mean, he's been in the cabinet. He's been a mayor. He's clearly qualified to do the job. So fine. I think there is a big question though about what is the policy agenda. Yesterday we got bits and pieces. We got some of the top lines of the policy agenda. I'm not necessarily in agreement with people who say there was no detail in there, because actually, if you made a list of all the headline policy initiatives, there'd be quite a lot. The problem is, it's easy to have a headline policy initiative. What is the small print? How are you going to implement it? It wasn't necessarily the what, but the how is the big question. But what we did get from Andy Burnham yesterday was a political argument. And the one that sounded authentic and one that sounded like it was his, and indeed it was his. We never got that from Keir Starmer. So even if, and I think this is underpriced, and I think this is what people are missing, frankly, even if Andy Burnham is going to preserve 90% of what the government is already doing, despite the big promises of change, even if Andy Burnham just picks up Keir Starmer's political agenda, policy agenda, everything that was in the King's speech, and basically runs with it or tweaks it cosmetically, maybe that is what happens, because I know that there are people around Andy Burnham who are finding the policy development process incredibly stressful because they're trying to build the plane as they're flying it. But let's see. I mean, it's definitely true that there is a lot to do, but Labour has a mandate. Labour has a big policy, a big-ish policy offer already in train, and it's not beyond the realms of possibility that Andy Burnham is merely a new frontman for this government's existing agenda.
And you're saying the suggestion is that he's more credible, and therefore it doesn't matter if he follows the same steps, because actually he's just not Keir Starmer, ultimately.
Well, yeah. Look, I mean that is the long and short of. Ultimately, that was the long and short of Labour's problem, right?
Yeah.
We can also, if you believe, by the way, that Keir Starmer did improve the country, and that actually the Labour government's doing an okay job, and that it's achieving key things in its policies, but it's just unpopular, and lots of Labour MPs think that, then actually, yeah, maybe Andy Burnham is a credible offer because you just get someone who can make a better political argument.
Well, we will find out. Patrick, thank you very much. Great to have you with us.
Thanks.
That is Patrick Maguire there, the Times chief political commentator. Really worth reading his piece in the paper today.
I think it's a very fair and sympathetic account of Burnham, and actually the opposite is very true. If you read a lot of the papers today, there are some people who've got it in for Andy Burnham. Anything he says is the end of the world, and he wants to tear everything down. I still come back to this point. At what stage was the British people asked if they want this level of devolution, if they want Britain to be rewired, if they want number 10 to be split between two locations and have a completely different way of governing the country, the biggest revolution in Whitehall in a century, that sounds pretty significant. And if it's not significant, why are we doing it? And if it is significant, where's the mandate? I cannot get the answers to that question. If this is as big as we're supposed to believe it is, then have a general election and let's vote for it. If it's not, then stop showing off about it.
I suppose the answer is both. The answer is that what Andy Burnham would say is that he's following the steps set out in the Labour manifesto, because what that manifesto promised was both change and an increase in your prosperity. The feeling that government will tread lighter on your life, and also that you'll be a bit better off and it will be easier to do the small things. If the answer to that question, which people voted was something that they wanted, is devolution, is changing the way that we run the economy, then he will feel that he has got a mandate to do that. The problem is whether or not this is, as you say, as significant as he's discussing, or is some of this about selling the same idea in a slightly different way to convince markets and the country, incidentally, that we can do this, and is part of it about hope?
I just think the argument of saying continuity through change is the very definition of casuistry, logic chopping. It's a deal that you're offering people. You're basically saying, I'm making fundamental changes, but don't worry, it's more or less along the same lines as
Well, he's not really saying that, though, is he? He's saying something quite different, but he's saying we're going to get to the same place, and ultimately the journey might differ slightly, but the place we end up in is the same. I also think probably if you're Andy Burnham right now, you're probably making an assumption that, you know, you've got a couple of years to start this stuff off, and by the way, deliver the tail end of what Keir Starmer has started, which people have already agreed to, and then you're going to have to fight another election.
But all politicians promise the same destination. They all promise fairer society, growth, more prosperity. And actually the route by which we're expected to believe they'll get there is the very heart of democracy. They say, I'm going to go this way, and we either believe them or we don't believe them. The outcome is always going to be the same, which is a better Britain. They never reach it, but they're always promising the same
I think
stuff.
that's kind of oversimplifying, isn't it? Because some of the big fundamental things those parties don't necessarily agree on. And those are the things that elections are fought on and won or lost on.
Yeah.
But, you know, that this conversation is very much going to continue. It's also why I do think people can listen to the same speech by Andy Burnham, and some will say it's the same as we've already had, and some will say, oh my God, it's a massive change.
Well, Alistair says he's cleaning up the system to put in to lance the manifesto policies, to put in place the manifesto policies. There'll be a general election in a couple of years when the direction is clear, but before too much has changed. A breath of fresh air, honest about problems and need for long-term solution.